The Boston Garden Arena buzzed with an energy that seemed almost electric on that cool April evening in 1968. Thousands of people had gathered, their voices creating a low hum of anticipation that filled every corner of the massive venue. The stage lights cast long shadows across the polished floor, and the air itself seemed to vibrate with expectation. Outside, the streets were quiet but tense, as the entire city held its breath. This was no ordinary concert night. This was a moment that would define what music could mean to a community standing at a crossroads. James Brown stood backstage, his signature processed hair immaculate, his burgundy suit pressed to perfection. He could hear the crowd beyond the curtain, their excited conversations blending into a symphony of hope. His band members were making final adjustments to their instruments, the familiar ritual bringing him a sense of calm amid the storm brewing around them. For weeks, city officials had debated whether this concert should happen at all. Some called it dangerous, others called it necessary. James had called it inevitable. Music, he believed, had a power that transcended fear, and tonight he would prove it. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. This wasn't just about entertainment. This was about showing that people could come together, that joy could exist even in difficult times, and that trust between communities and their leaders could be rebuilt through respect and understanding. The stage manager approached him with an urgent expression, his clipboard clutched tightly against his chest. "Mr. Brown, we have a situation," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. James opened his eyes and turned to face him, reading the concern written across the younger man's features. "Governor Sargent is here. He's at the front of the stage right now with several officials. They're saying they want to speak with you before the show starts. Sir, they look serious." James felt his jaw tighten, but he maintained his composure. He had expected resistance, but not like this. Not at this moment, with thousands of people waiting just beyond that curtain. He straightened his jacket, rolled his shoulders back, and nodded slowly. "Then I suppose we shouldn't keep the governor waiting," he said, his voice steady and calm. As he walked toward the stage entrance, his band members exchanged worried glances, but James didn't look back. He had faced opposition before, had overcome obstacles that would have stopped lesser men. Tonight would be no different. When James stepped onto the stage, the crowd erupted into cheers that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. The sound was deafening, a wave of pure emotion that washed over him like warm water. But his attention was immediately drawn to the group of men standing at the front of the stage, their suits dark and their expressions stern. Governor Francis Sargent stood at the center, his arms crossed, flanked by police officials and city administrators. The governor was a tall man with sharp features and eyes that seemed to calculate every possibility. Behind him, several officers stood at attention, their presence a clear message about the seriousness of the situation. James walked to the edge of the stage and looked down at them, his expression calm but his eyes intense. The crowd's cheers began to fade, as people noticed the unusual scene unfolding before them, replaced by confused murmurs and concerned whispers. "Mr. Brown," Governor Sargent called up to him, his voice carrying authority but also an edge of uncertainty. "We need to discuss the parameters of tonight's event. There are concerns about public safety, about the potential for this gathering to escalate into something uncontrollable." James stood silent for a moment, letting the governor's words hang in the air. He could feel thousands of eyes on him, waiting to see how he would respond. The lights were hot on his face, and somewhere in the back of his mind he registered the familiar sensation of being on stage, of being exactly where he was meant to be. He leaned forward slightly, his hands on his hips, and when he spoke his voice was clear and measured, carrying across the arena with the same power that made his singing legendary. "Governor Sargent," James began, his tone respectful but firm, "these people came here tonight for music. They came here to feel something good, to be part of something positive. They didn't come here to cause trouble, and neither did I." He paused, letting his words sink in. "I understand your concerns, sir, I truly do. These are challenging times for everyone. But shutting down this concert, asking these folks to go home without the experience they came for, that's not going to make things better. That's going to make them feel like they're not trusted, like they're not valued." The crowd behind him had gone completely silent now, every person straining to hear the exchange. James could sense their tension, their hope, their need for this moment to go the right way. Governor Sargent shifted his weight, clearly not expecting such a direct and articulate response. He conferred briefly with the officials beside him, their heads together in hushed conversation. One of the police commanders leaned in and said something that made the governor's expression tighten. When Sergeant looked back up at James, there was a new quality to his gaze, something that suggested he was reassessing the situation. "Mr. Brown, the city has been through a difficult period. We have a responsibility to prevent any situation that might lead to disorder or harm. Your influence is undeniable, which is precisely why we're concerned. What guarantee can you give us that this event will remain peaceful?" James took a deep breath, feeling the magnitude of the question. This was the moment everything hinged on. He thought about his journey, about every stage he had stood on, every crowd he had moved with his music and his message. He thought about the responsibility that came with his success and the opportunity that stood before him now. "Governor," he said, his voice dropping slightly, becoming more intimate despite the vastness of the space. "I can't guarantee what every single person will do. Nobody can. But what I can tell you is this: music brings people together. It reminds us of our humanity. It gives us a way to express what we're feeling without anger, without destruction. These people trust me and I trust them. If you let this concert happen, if you show them that respect, they'll show you the same in return." The arena remained suspended in silence, the air thick with anticipation. Governor Sargent looked up at James Brown, then out at the sea of faces watching the exchange with intense focus. The officials around him seemed frozen, waiting for his decision. James could see the internal struggle playing out across the governor's features, the weight of responsibility pressing down on everyone involved. This wasn't just about one concert. This was about faith in people, about whether leaders would choose trust or fear. James stood tall on that stage, his presence commanding, his conviction unshakable. He had said his piece. Now the world would see what choice the governor would make, and what kind of night this would become for the city of Boston. The seconds stretched into what felt like minutes, as Governor Sargent stood at the base of the stage, his eyes locked with James Brown's. The entire Boston Garden seemed to hold its breath, thousands of people waiting to see if their evening would end in disappointment or celebration. James could feel the tension radiating from every corner of the arena, could sense the collective hope of the crowd pressing against his back like a physical force. He remained perfectly still, his posture confident but not confrontational, his expression open but determined. This was a test of wills, but more importantly, it was a test of faith in humanity. The governor's officials continued their hushed deliberations, their body language suggesting disagreement among themselves about the best course of action. One of them, an older man with silver hair and a weathered face, kept glancing up at the crowd with an expression that seemed almost sympathetic, as if he understood what this moment meant to the people gathered here. Finally, Governor Sargent raised his hand, silencing his advisers. He stepped forward closer to the stage, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost some of its official stiffness. "Mr. Brown, your words carry weight, and I can see that the people here respect you deeply, but I need more than words. I need your commitment, that you will use your influence to maintain calm, that you will actively work with us to ensure everyone goes home safely tonight." James nodded slowly, understanding that this was the bridge they needed to cross together. "Governor, you have my word, not just as an entertainer, but as a man who cares about this community. I'll do everything in my power to make sure tonight is remembered for the right reasons. Music has always been my way of bringing people together, and tonight will be no different. But I need you to trust these people. They deserve that trust." The governor looked out at the crowd again, his gaze sweeping across the faces illuminated by the stage lights. He saw young people and old families and friends, all united by their love of music and their need for a moment of joy in troubled times. Something in his expression shifted, a subtle softening around his eyes that suggested he was seeing past his fears and into the hearts of the people before him. He turned back to his officials and said something quietly, then looked up at James one more time. "All right, Mr. Brown, the concert will proceed, but I'm going to stay here tonight in the arena to see for myself what you've promised. If you're right about the power of music to unite, then I want to witness it. And if there's any sign of trouble, we'll need to address it immediately." James felt relief wash through him, but he kept his composure, extending his hand down toward the governor in a gesture of partnership. "You won't regret this decision, Governor. I promise you that." Governor Sargent hesitated for just a moment, then reached up and shook James Brown's hand firmly. The gesture was symbolic, a bridge built between authority and artistry, between caution and courage. The crowd, which had been watching with anxious silence, suddenly erupted into applause and cheers that seemed to lift the very roof of the Boston Garden. The sound was thunderous, a release of tension that had been building not just in the past few minutes, but over weeks of uncertainty and concern. James squeezed the governor's hand once more before releasing it, then turned to face his audience fully. His face broke into a broad smile, the first genuine smile of the evening, and he raised both arms in the air in acknowledgement of their support. The band behind him, sensing that the crisis had passed, began warming up their instruments again, the familiar sounds bringing normalcy back to the extraordinary evening. As Governor Sargent and his entourage moved to seats that had been arranged for them near the front of the stage, James took a moment to center himself. He walked back toward his band, exchanging quick nods and reassuring smiles with his musicians. His drummer gave him a thumbs up, his bass player grinned broadly, and his horn section seemed to stand a little taller, energized by what had just transpired. James picked up his microphone, feeling its familiar weight in his hand, and returned to center stage. The crowd's cheers hadn't diminished at all. If anything, they had grown louder, more jubilant. As people realized that their evening wasn't going to be taken from them, James let them cheer, let them release all the emotion they had been holding in. He understood that this moment was about more than just him or his music. It was about dignity, respect, and the right to gather in peace. When James finally raised his hand, the crowd gradually quieted, though the energy in the room remained electric. He looked out at the sea of faces, taking in the diversity of the audience, the hope shining in their eyes, the trust they were placing in him. He thought about the responsibility that came with this platform, about how his words and actions tonight would ripple far beyond the walls of this arena. "Boston," he began, his voice powerful and clear through the sound system. "We just witnessed something special here. We witnessed what can happen when people communicate, when they listen to each other, when they choose understanding over fear." The crowd responded with enthusiastic applause, and James let them, feeding off their energy. "Governor Sargent made a brave choice tonight. He chose to trust you, to trust us, and we're going to show him that his trust was well placed, aren't we?" The affirmative roar from the crowd was deafening, a collective promise made by thousands of voices united in purpose. James could see Governor Sargent in his seat, the man's expression still serious, but noticeably less tense than before. Several of the officials with him were leaning back in their chairs, apparently accepting that the evening was going to proceed as planned. James felt a surge of determination flowing through him. This performance had to be more than just good. It had to be transcendent. It had to prove that music could indeed be a force for unity, that gathering in celebration could strengthen a community rather than divide it. He turned to his band and gave them the signal they had been waiting for all evening. The opening notes of his first song began to fill the arena, the rhythm section laying down a groove that was impossible to resist. As James launched into his performance, something magical began to happen in the Boston Garden. The music seemed to dissolve the remaining tension in the room, replacing it with pure joy and energy. People began to dance in the aisles, their movements free and uninhibited. Strangers smiled at each other, sharing in the collective experience of witnessing something truly special. James moved across the stage with his characteristic intensity, his voice soaring through songs that had become anthems, his dance moves precise and powerful. Every note he sang, every step he took, was infused with purpose. He wasn't just performing, he was proving a point. He was demonstrating that music could be a bridge, that art could heal, that coming together in celebration was an act of hope and defiance against those who would rather see communities divided. Between songs, James would speak to the crowd, his words carefully chosen to reinforce the message of peace and unity. "We've got people watching us tonight," he would say, gesturing toward where the governor and officials sat. "Let's show them what Boston is really about. Let's show them the power of coming together, of respecting each other, of celebrating life through music." And the crowd would respond with enthusiasm, their behavior throughout the evening exemplary. There were no disturbances, no conflicts, no reason for concern. Instead, there was laughter, there was dancing, there was singing along to familiar choruses. Parents danced with their children, friends embraced, and strangers became connected through the shared experience of witnessing a legendary performer at the height of his powers. Governor Sargent, from his position near the front, watched the entire spectacle with an expression that gradually transformed from cautious observation to something approaching wonder. He could see what James had promised him, a community united by music, people from all backgrounds celebrating together without conflict or aggression. At one point during the performance, James caught the governor's eye and gave him a knowing nod, a silent communication that said, "I told you so," without arrogance, simply with the confidence of someone who understood his audience and his craft. The governor nodded back, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth, an acknowledgement that he had witnessed something he hadn't fully believed was possible. As the concert progressed through its set list, the energy in the Boston Garden only intensified. James performed with every ounce of passion he possessed, his voice raw with emotion, his movements conveying the urgency and importance of this particular show. His band matched his intensity, every musician locked into the groove, creating a sonic landscape that was both familiar and transcendent. The horn section punctuated key moments with precise blasts of sound. The rhythm section maintained a pocket that was unshakable, and James himself seemed to be channeling something beyond mere performance. This was artistry in service of a greater purpose, entertainment that carried a message of hope and possibility. During one particularly powerful moment in the show, James slowed things down, asking the band to bring the volume down to almost nothing. The crowd quieted in response, sensing that something important was about to happen. James stood at the edge of the stage, the microphone held loosely in his hand, and spoke directly to his audience. "You know, people were afraid to let us have tonight. They thought that bringing us all together might be dangerous. But look around you. Look at what we've created here. This is what happens when people are given the chance to come together with good intentions. This is what happens when communities are trusted. This right here, what we're sharing in this moment, this is more powerful than any fear, any doubt, any division." The crowd responded with a wave of applause that built slowly and then swelled into something enormous, a standing ovation in the middle of the concert that lasted several minutes. People were on their feet, some with tears in their eyes, all united in the recognition that they were part of something significant. James let the moment breathe, let it expand and fill the space, let everyone feel the weight and beauty of what they had collectively achieved. When the applause finally began to subside, he brought the microphone back to his lips and said simply, "Let's keep this feeling going. Let's take this energy and spread it beyond these walls. Let's show the world what Boston is capable of." The rest of the concert was a celebration, pure and simple. James performed his biggest hits, the songs that had made him a legend, and the crowd sang along with every word. The atmosphere was jubilant but never chaotic, energetic but never aggressive. It was exactly what James had promised Governor Sargent it would be, a gathering of people united by their love of music, their appreciation for artistry, and their commitment to demonstrating that communities could come together peacefully, even in challenging times. As the final songs of the evening played out, James could see venue staff and even some of the police officers who had been stationed throughout the arena starting to relax, some even moving slightly to the music, caught up in the infectious joy that permeated every corner of the space. When James finally concluded the concert with his signature closing, the crowd erupted one last time, their appreciation pouring out in waves of sound that seemed endless. He took his bows alongside his band members, each of them beaming with the satisfaction of a job well done and a promise kept. As the house lights came up and people began to make their way toward the exits, the atmosphere remained positive and celebratory. Families gathered their belongings, friends made plans to continue their evening, and throughout it all, there was an unmistakable sense of pride and accomplishment. They had been part of something historic, something that proved skeptics wrong, and demonstrated the best of what humanity could achieve when given the opportunity. Backstage, after the crowds had begun to disperse, Governor Sargent made his way to James Brown's dressing room. The officials and security who had accompanied him earlier in the evening now seemed almost sheepish, their earlier concerns having been thoroughly disproven by the events of the night. When the governor entered the room, James stood to greet him, still wearing his stage clothes, though his jacket was now draped over a chair, and his face showed the satisfied exhaustion of a performer who had given everything. The two men looked at each other for a moment, before the governor extended his hand once more. "Mr. Brown, I owe you an acknowledgement. What I witnessed tonight challenged my assumptions and exceeded my hopes. You were right about your audience, about the power of music, and about the importance of trust. James shook the governor's hand warmly, a genuine smile crossing his features. "Governor Sargent, I appreciate you saying that, and more than that, I appreciate you being willing to take the chance. Tonight happened because you made a choice to believe in people. That takes courage, especially for someone in your position." The governor nodded thoughtfully. "I learned something important tonight. Sometimes the greatest risk is not trusting people to do the right thing. You've given me a new perspective, and I suspect this evening will influence how I approach leadership going forward." They talked for several more minutes, discussing the implications of the evening, the responses they expected from the media, and the broader message that tonight's success sent to other communities facing similar challenges. As Governor Sargent and his entourage prepared to leave, he paused at the doorway and turned back to James one final time. "Thank you, Mr. Brown. Not just for the performance, but for showing us what's possible. You didn't just entertain people tonight. You brought a community together and reminded us all of our shared humanity. That's a gift that extends far beyond music." James nodded, accepting the compliment with grace. "That's always been my goal, Governor. To use what I've been given to make things a little better, to bring people a little closer. Tonight was special, but it doesn't have to be unique. Imagine if every community, every leader, approached gatherings with the same trust you showed tonight. Imagine what we could accomplish." After the governor departed, James sat alone in his dressing room for a few quiet moments, reflecting on the evening's events. He thought about the standoff that could have ended in cancellation and disappointment, about the words he had chosen, and the faith he had placed in his audience. He thought about the thousands of people who had proven that trust was warranted, who had celebrated together peacefully and joyfully. Most of all, he thought about the power of music to transcend barriers, to unite people across divides, and to create moments of genuine connection in a world that often seemed determined to pull people apart. Tonight had been more than a concert. It had been a statement, a proof of concept, a demonstration that art and community could work together to overcome fear and suspicion. As James finally began to change out of his stage clothes, preparing to head back to his hotel, he could hear his band members celebrating in the adjacent room, their laughter and excited conversation a reminder of what they had accomplished together. The night had started with confrontation and ended in triumph, not through aggression or compromise, but through communication, respect, and an unwavering belief in the goodness of people when given the chance to prove it. James Brown had faced down a governor's concerns, not with anger but with conviction, had backed up his words with an unforgettable performance, and had demonstrated that sometimes the bravest act is simply trusting people to rise to the occasion. The reverberations of this evening would extend far beyond Boston, inspiring other artists, other communities, and other leaders to choose faith over fear, unity over division, and the transformative power of music over the paralysis of doubt.